Now, Moody's Investors Service says subdued US dollar supply in the context of prolonged lower oil prices remain a key challenge for corporates in Nigeria, especially those companies constrained by foreign exchange restrictions on certain imports. Doug Rollins, Assistant Vice President, Corporate Finance Group at Moody's, joined me to discuss this development. Well, nice to have you on the show, Douglas. Thank you so much for your time. Now, of course, talking about Nigeria's corporate sector, what do you make of what's happening in that space at the moment?
One of the big focal points that we have in terms of trying to get a sense of what 2017 is looking like is the US dollar supply. It has been a big constraint to corporate growth and corporate operations in Nigeria. And there are a number of different dynamics when we look at US dollar supply, and it's difficult to see how things are going to play out. But in saying that, I think that there are some features where we see US dollar supply improving, and that will come about through a narrowing or a convergence between the parallel market rates and the official market rate. That will largely be determined by increased refining capacity. So 40% of the import bill in Nigeria is attributed to imported refined products in Nigeria. So an alleviation of that burden will obviously unlock a lot of US dollar accessibility. The other big positive that we're seeing is with more stability in the Delta state, you're seeing production run rates at around 2.2 million barrels per day, and that is going to alleviate a lot of the burden. We've already seen that come through in the parallel market. Yesterday we had it settled at 425, but Thursday last week they were calling it at 390. So you're starting to get better convergence and a differing picture in terms of what we saw end of October, where it is at around 480. So with those improvements, we expect that the corporate sector should start getting better accessibility. But in saying that though, it still looks like 2017 will be a constrained, challenging environment, but a lot of corporates have been very adept at realigning their operations to cope with low US dollar accessibility and also the low growth outlook that you have for Nigeria currently. And they've done that through increasing prices to reflect the devaluation of the Naira and actively taking costs out of the system. And they've also significantly reduced CapEx, which has improved cash flow, and cash balances started to go up as a result.
Now, of course, talking about the factors that point to the positives, I'm just going to take you up on one of the issues you mentioned, talking about stability in Nigeria's Niger Delta region. I mean, we did read a report of another explosion in that region. I mean, what makes you think we're going to get some level of stability anytime soon?
A very good question. I think, again, you still do have a lot of sabotage occurring, but there's been a lot of ingenuity in terms of how they're directing the flow of oil. So there's a lot of contingency planning that if a pipeline does go down, how you work around it so that you can actually quickly resume requisite flow to the export terminals. So I think that there's been a lot of work that's been done on that. But I agree with you that it still is a challenging environment, and nobody knows, specifically in December where you have the run up to the Christmas season and a lot of people wanting to buy gifts. And again, also against the backdrop of a very tough and challenging economic environment where jobless levels have increased. How that potentially could feed into the equation in the Delta. So I think that currently, as I say, we're seeing a good run rate, but it's how much longer it can be sustained for. Again, a lot of question marks running into December and potentially what 2017 will hold.
Of course, talking about this, the shortage of foreign exchange, it has dominated discussions on our shows here on CNBC and, of course, on other stations and the papers as well. Do you see an end in sight?
I wouldn't say we see an end in sight, but I think if you have a confluence of positives, so if stability remains around, let's say, 2.2 million barrels a day sort of for 2017, you have refining, and again, sort of domestic refining capacity is around 19.1% based on the latest NNPC figures. If you have that starting to ramp up, you immediately have a lot more dollar inflow and less dollar reliance in terms of the import bill. One of the other positive considerations that we are starting to see now is a trickle effect in terms of portfolio inflows, and it's a chicken and egg scenario. So in order for international investors to come into the domestic market, they need to see a greater convergence in terms of parallel market rate and obviously where we see the official market rate, which gives them greater comfort that you're not going to see a depreciation in terms of what they invest into the country. But obviously, I mean, it actually is assisted just purely by them investing. That frees up dollar availability, and it eliminates that very steep divergence in terms of those two rates. So I think with these positive considerations that we're seeing in Delta now, and assuming they can keep that run rate, ramp up in refining, and a reduction in terms of petroleum or the refined petroleum products coming in, it's starting to look a lot better for 2017. But again, if you see any difference in terms of those considerations, the picture in terms of US dollar supply will be constrained and could be challenging along the same lines where we saw actually in October.
All right, then, of course, taking a look at your report, you did mention the foreign capital inflows in Nigeria are unlikely to rebound strongly as the existence of parallel markets acts as a deterrent. What do you make of this? Because at the moment, of course, we do know the effect this is having on investors coming into the country. Investors want to be sure that they're going to get the value for their money for what they're actually bringing in at a particular point in time. You know, should there be a rebound? Let's talk positive now. What do you think will drive this?
Oh, yeah, I think we're already starting to see that. So again, assuming that we see very good production levels in Delta, that will definitely start swinging sentiment. And we're already starting to see inward investment, also recognizing sort of where the parallel market's gone. So it's come down significantly from the end of October. So as I say, we had 480, tracked down to 390 on Thursday last week. We had 425 yesterday. But as I say, if you have more of a convergence, that's definitely going to encourage more inward investment. And I think it's what a lot of people forget is it's not just the portfolio inflows that will come into the country, which obviously creates bigger market appetite for corporates trying to go out to get capital either in the form of equity or capital in the form of debt financing to do large-scale capital expansion. But one of the other considerations is multinational corporates. I mean, Nigeria is still a very compelling market. It's a market that most multinationals want to always be in for the long term and continue to grow their footprint in Nigeria. But in order to do that, they also want to have some reasonable expectation that they bring money in, you're not going to have a sort of a 60% devaluation, which we saw in June, which is obviously driven by CBN activity. But again, you don't want to necessarily have that in terms of bringing dollars into the country. So if we do have that convergence, I think that you're going to not only have net portfolio inflows, but you can have the corporate sector outside of Nigeria more actively committing capital into the country because they also know that if they need dollars or they want to take dollars out, they have the ability to do so because, as I say, you've got that convergence and you've got better dollar supply.
Now, Douglas, of course, while we have foreign investors who are still skeptical about stepping in, there are, of course, companies that are also present here and also looking to penetrate the Nigerian market. What do you think is driving such corporate organizations, and what do you think will drive other corporate organizations to thread this part, irrespective of the challenges before them?
I think the most important thing when we also look at the Nigerian market is the very compelling fundamentals when you look at the demographics. So not only do you have a growing population, but you have a growing young population. So you're going to have a growing young population which is increasingly going to demand goods and services. And again, just the scale of the market means that, as I say, when you look at the corporate sector, you want to be here just in terms of the revenue that you'll be able to generate long term. And I think one of the considerations that we take on board in terms of looking at that picture is not only, as I say, that population and sort of that you've got a young population, but actively how sort of Nigeria is reinventing itself, reinventing how it is looking at itself, especially when we look at the actual telecom sector. The telecom sector specifically is creating a lot of ingenuity, creating business angles that previously weren't there as people have better access to the internet and better access to broadband. So I think that these are all very good considerations. And then the last point that I think a lot of the corporates, not only domestically, but your multinationals looking into Nigeria, are very focused on is the urbanization angle. Urbanization for any corporate is very good in terms of unit costs or unit for a service because you have a mass captive audience, which means your delivery of product and services is reduced, as I say, on a per unit or per service cost because you have low transportation costs if you're looking at product because you can distribute your product over a smaller geography to a large audience. And similarly, if, let's say, you're a telco operator, you're rolling out 4G and 3G, if you've, let's say, got a very populated area such as Lagos, it makes it a lot easier to obviously set up towers, and we've recently rated IHS, which is a big growth angle that we see. So the towers market continues to grow in Nigeria, but you've got that captive ability to transmit and transmit over a smaller distance, which is more compelling economically. So as I say, the service angle, the product angle from urbanization is very important as we start to see the population centered around your major metropoles in Nigeria.
That's a very interesting picture you've painted there. My question now is, what do you think the Nigerian government should be doing at this point in time to maximize these potentials you've just listed?
I think, to be clear, Anya, we can't act in a prescriptive manner. So as a credit rating agency, we can only give our opinion in terms of what the government's doing. We can't prescribe what the government should be doing. But I think what I did highlight is, as I say, if you have all of these positives, so talking to refining utilization rates, talking to what we're seeing in the Delta, and again, just trying to encourage that inward investment angle, not only from sort of your portfolio investors or your international asset managers and getting them comfortable about coming back into the country, but also your corporates from a multinational perspective, bringing dollars in to expand operations in Nigeria. I think if you start bringing all those factors together, as I say, we start seeing a more positive consideration in terms of how the economy will grow, as well as how US dollar supply will improve.
Just on a final note, you have painted a very good picture on the factors that will drive, of course, positive growth prospects in the next 3 years. Can you just highlight some of the challenges you also foresee?
Well, I think, again, you take those positives, but it's whether they actually emanate. So we are not sure what's going to happen in the production in 2017. We're not sure in terms of what will happen in terms of refinery utilization rates. So if you start seeing those go in the wrong direction, it definitely does create challenges for corporates. But in saying that, I think that we're still looking at a very weak growth environment for 2017. So for the corporate sector specifically, I think that they've been very proactive in terms of how they've realigned their operations to cope with the current economic backdrop. But as I say, we are seeing weak economic growth. So you're not going to see the growth levels and the top line growth that you've seen sort of over the past decade. So in that respect, it will remain challenging. But I think if we start seeing, as I say, coming back to those three factors I mentioned, and US dollar supply improving, that will create a big growth angle from a corporate perspective.
And that was Doug Rollins, Assistant Vice President, Moody's Investors Service.